The story I'm going to tell took place on Halloween. A little preface to this night. One of my classmates' families owned a house in that beach community, and her dad loved to tell ghost stories that took place there. Some stories were his, some his siblings, and some happened to my friend's sister. We would all hang out there in the summer, and sometimes my friend's sisters would take their friends there in the winter months. There were times that the landline phones would ring, and there would be scary voices on the other end. Other times, it would just be footsteps or things misplaced. My friend's dad was always trying to choose the scariest stories that happened there to spook us right before we went to sleep during sleepovers. We were never really sure if we believed him until one particular night. It was Halloween. It was on a school night, and we were 17, making us too old to trick or treat, but too young to throw a party during the school week. At school that day, my friend and I decided to go to the beach house with another friend of ours and have her dad meet us there to tell us scary stories. Since it was the fall, there was no one in the beach town, and her family was at their year-round house a few miles away. The three of us girls arrived at the house before the father. No other cars in the community, no one else to be seen or heard on the entire street. We went inside to get some candles from the kitchen, as there was no electricity during the fall and winter months, because her family turned the power off during the off-seasons. There were 4 candles on the kitchen table, and we grabbed 3 because there were 3 of us. We lit them in the family room while we waited for her dad to arrive and start the stories. While we were waiting, we started talking about scary things that could happen. Things like, what if someone had walked down the stairs right now? Or what if our candles all blew out? Or what would happen if the refrigerator opened and we heard someone laughing? The house was a 2-story, with a screened porch on the front, and in the back there was a smaller screened porch, with about 10 or 15 wooden steps that led up to the back door. While we were laughing and carrying on about our candles blowing out and ghosts walking down the stairs, we heard someone run up and down the back outdoor steps. We assumed it was her dad trying to scare us. He always did. We started saying out loud in sarcastic tones, "Oh my God, we're so scared. Ghosts aren't real. We know it's you, Dad." The footsteps were still going up and down the stairs, but they began to get faster, and soon the screen door started opening and slamming shut. At the same time, the footsteps ran even faster up and down the back steps. We couldn't see any of this from where we were in the family room. We just heard it. But it was loud, and impossible for one person to do at a time. The 3 of us looked at each other in fear, and we ran out the front of the house, leaving the candles lit inside. At this point, we were standing in the driveway, and there were still no cars anywhere. My friend, whose family owned the place, said we all had to walk around back to check for her dad because she wasn't going alone. So, we all went out back. There was no one there. As we walked back to the front, there was a candle lit on the front steps. This scared us because we left all our candles on the floor in the family room. My friend decided she was going to walk around alone, and we kept watch out front. If it was her dad, he would have had to have been going the opposite way and was still hiding. Me and the other girl were standing in the driveway. We were looking at the house into the family room where we had been sitting. We were keeping an eye out for her dad. Suddenly, we saw a shadow inside. It appeared to be taking our candles and placing them on the mantel in the family room. My friend came running up the side of the house. She said she couldn't find her dad. Me and the other friend were pointing at the candles on the mantel, telling her what we saw. As we said this, her dad pulled up. He saw us standing outside and asked if there was a problem. We told him what had happened, and his face got very serious, and he told us to get in the car and lock it. He ran into the house, blew out the candles, and ran out. I'm not even sure if he took time to lock the door behind him. He drove us to their year-round house, and there we told him everything that had happened. He looked scared. He never laughed or fessed up to it being him. I have lost touch with my friend whose family the house belonged to, but I do often wonder how they're doing, and if that house is still theirs, and if they have had any new encounters. This story is from Anna in Colgate, Wisconsin. Shadow in the Night. This story took place when I was 13. I had just curled up in my bed with a book when I heard a tapping on my bedroom window. At first I ignored it, figuring I would leave it alone. But being young, I let my curiosity get the best of me and headed over to the sound so I could at least get a peek out of the window. After doing so, I'll never forget what I saw. It was a tall figure in a black suit looking down at me. He must have been over 6 feet tall, but the face, or lack thereof, was what freaked me out the most. For a moment I was frozen in fear, but I snapped out of it and shut the drapes. A few moments later, I decided to check if it was still out there. I peeked out the curtains, but he was gone. Story comes to us from Virginia in Myakka City, Florida. Sleeping Dog. We moved to the home we now live in 2014. Our bedroom has 2 exit doors, one to the hall and one to the master bathroom. At this time, we had only slept in the house for 4 days, and every night our dog slept at the exit by the master bathroom. So during the night, if we had to use the restroom, we had to step over the sleeping dog. On the 5th night, I woke up and needed to use the bathroom. As I got up, I glanced into the exit by the hall and saw the dog sleeping by that doorway. I thought, that's a better place for him to sleep, so I don't kick him by accident. So walking to the bathroom entrance, I tripped over my dog. He was lying in the same spot he had been the last 4 days. A few days after that happened, we were talking to the next door neighbor. He told us that his friend had lived in the house before us. One time, the friend called our neighbor to ask for help. His dog was really sick and not expected to live the night. Our neighbor told us that the dog had died, and he helped his friend bury the dog between 2 oak trees in our yard. I think the dog was welcoming us to the new home and letting us know it was safe to live there. I have not seen him since, and we still have to step over our dog who's blocking the bathroom. And here's a kind of doppelganger story from Hannah in Mequon, Wisconsin. Not my dad. I was about 12. We had just moved into our house in Mequon, Wisconsin. My parents had a TV in the corner of their master bedroom, and parallel to that corner was my dad's walk-in closet. I was watching TV one afternoon in the bedroom, and I felt someone walk into the room behind me and walk past me toward my dad's closet. My dad always kissed me on the head or said hi or something. He's yelled at me and my brothers for not greeting him and my mom when we walk in the house, so he's a big stickler in that respect. I thought this was weird that he didn't say anything, so I turned to see a man, who looked just like my dad, walk into the closet and turn the light on. When I think back on it, though, I don't remember him taking steps. He was just moving. I watched TV a little while longer, waiting for him to come out, as he was prone to being cranky, and maybe he was just having a bad day. After about 5 minutes, I got up to check in the closet and say hi. There was nobody in there. Maybe I had been too engrossed in the cartoons to notice, so I went into the kitchen and my mom was making lunch. I leaned on the counter and asked where Dad was. He went on a business trip to China. My dad traveled so much, he hardly let us know when he was going on a trip. I have no idea what was in my house that day, but that specific thing never showed up again. A self-narrated story from Macy in Texas. Babysitting Ghost.
Hi Lex, this is Macy from Texas, and today I wanted to share one of my paranormal experiences. So, when I first started babysitting, one of the first jobs I got was this old house in the middle of nowhere with 2 children, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they had this big Labrador retriever who was like really, really sweet, and most of the time he would just kind of lay around and sleep in the kitchen anytime I was there. He really wouldn't do anything. Really sweet dog. So as the night's going, it's going fairly normally. Me and the 5-year-old are watching TV, and I'm looking down the hall, and the 3-year-old's off in her room playing with her dolls, and I'm looking in the door watching her play. And I decide to go check on her, and as I'm walking down the hall, I can hear her having a conversation with someone. And it doesn't really sound like just talking to yourself or just kind of babbling to yourself. It actually sounds like she's having a conversation with someone. Like she's asking questions and then waiting and responding, and it sounds like she's answering questions. So I kind of listen at the door, and she's like whispering and having this like secret conversation with someone. So I poke my head in and ask what she's doing, and she whips her head around really quickly and then just all of a sudden goes, "Oh, no, nothing." So I think, okay, that's a little weird, but I she's 3, so she could be just having a conversation. I go back into the living room to get something out of the fridge, and I step over the dog who's sleeping in the kitchen as always, and all of a sudden he jumps up and just starts barking loudly, ferociously. For a minute, I thought he was just going to lunge at me and attack me. I was so scared. And I jump up and I look at him, and I notice that he's barking and freaking out, but he's not moving. He's just standing there, completely still, just not moving his feet at all. And he's not even barking at me. I notice that he's barking at whatever's behind me in the laundry room, but there's no windows, there's no doors in the back. It's just kind of a kitchen and a little alcove and the laundry room. And I'm just staring at him, barking at me ferociously. I'm trying to call his name or like wave food in front of his face, and he's just dead set, staring directly behind me over my shoulder, barking his head off. It was super freaky, and he didn't stop until the 5-year-old yelled at him to stop, and then he just quickly ran out of the kitchen into a bedroom. So, I thought that was pretty freaky, but I just tried to put it in the back of my mind because I didn't want to scare these kids I'm watching. And I put them to bed later on in the night, and I'm just sitting watching TV waiting for the parents to come home. And I walk down the hall to check on the kids, and all of a sudden the TV shuts off behind me. I'm thinking maybe the wire's faulty or I hit the remote. So I check on the kids and I go back and I turn the TV back on. And, I go to check on them again. And next thing I know, the TV shuts off the minute I turn my back and take a step into the hallway. And I walk back and I grab the remote and I turn it on and I walk back again, and then the TV shuts off again. So the third time I'm losing my patience, and I take the remote and I take the batteries out and I go and hit the TV button on the side to turn it on. And once again, the minute I turn around and take a foot in the hallway, the TV shuts off immediately. So at that point in the night, I say to myself, okay, you want the TV off? TV's off. And I just read the rest of the night and check on the kids. And the whole night, as I'm waiting, I feel strange. I don't feel like that normal kind of nervousness you get when you're in a house that you're unfamiliar with. It's like this fear. It felt like someone was watching me, and it felt like someone was in the house and that they did not want me in that house. Like the whole time I was thinking, I have to get out of this house. I cannot be here. The dog wouldn't come near me. The dog wouldn't go in the kitchen the rest of the night, and that's like his spot in the kitchen. So needless to say, after that night, I did not go back to that house at all. So that's my story. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm a huge fan of the show. Hopefully I'll send more in. Thanks for having me on, and take care.
A lot more creepy stories coming up. Hey, don't forget about the Anything Ghost VIP group. If you enjoy the 10 free stories that are available to you at anythingghost.com or wherever you listen to your Anything Ghost fix, you can get the complete archives by signing up for the Anything Ghost VIP group. I also send out an early release of each show by 2 to 3 days before it's released to the public, to the VIP group. And there's other extras too. There's a one-time membership fee that'll make you a lifetime member of the Anything Ghost VIP group, so check it out. Go to anythingghost.com and then go to the Join the VIP group tab. And here's a creepy story from Christine in the U.S. Doorways. The house I grew up in was, and likely remains, haunted. I lived in that house until I was 18. And throughout that time, I experienced unexplained sights and sounds regularly. The general layout of the house was a living room and a kitchen, of roughly the same size, adjacent to one another. These led to a hallway, with my brother's room and my room on the right side. On the left, a bathroom and my parents' room. Between my brother's room and mine was a Jack and Jill bathroom. Most of the time, many of these rooms did not have doors for reasons I would learn later. In my earliest memory of being in my room, I had awoken in the middle of the night, crying and calling for my mother. My mother had come into my room and turned on the light. I don't remember what had happened before then, but after that, I was petrified of the dark and proceeded to never sleep with the light off in my house. Except once. When I was about 12 years old, I had a friend over for a sleepover in my room. She very reasonably asked if we could have the light turned off. I was too embarrassed to insist otherwise, as I was definitely past the socially acceptable afraid of the dark age. I later woke up in the middle of the night to see the razor-sharp shape of what appeared to be a man with a state trooper hat on. He was stepping into the room from the hallway. I describe it as a shape because I could not discern any features. It was entirely black. The shape appeared to be looking down at my friend sleeping in her sleeping bag. It then turned to face me and started to walk toward me. I don't recall what had happened after that. The dark-shaped man was not the only thing that came from the hallway. Every night, I would try to fall asleep before the house became completely quiet. If this failed to happen, I would begin to see movement in the darkness of the hallway. Dark, not quite animal shapes, would course along the floor. Sometimes vague people shapes, too. I would always get the feeling that if the light were off, or if I didn't watch the hallway, something would come into my room and get me. Many nights, I opted to keep watch until morning, and sometimes, during these vigils, I would see fingers curl on the doorframe, not quite touching the portion in the light, but perched just so. Why not shut the door? Great question. I did this once, and woke up to see my doorless closet with what appeared to be large pieces of meat hanging inside of clothes. I pulled the covers over my head and waited until light outside. In the morning, it had all returned to normal. Another nightly occurrence was voices. The voices would come from the hallway. It always sounded like a conversation between at least 3 different people. The overall effect was something like a muffled television. In fact, I told myself that's what the voices were. Just my dad watching the television in the living room down the hall, unencumbered by doors. Even though the voices still happened when he was out of town, or when I had already seen him go into my parents' room. At one point, it was the Jack and Jill's bathroom turn to go partially doorless. The door on my side was removed, while the door on my brother's side stayed up. This doorway faced the end of my bed. At night, the bathroom light was off, while my room remained completely lit. After a few nights of being door-free, I woke up in the middle of the night to the shape of a person right in the bathroom doorway, faintly glowing a pale yellow. It looked to be an older man, completely featureless and filled with a pale, sickly light. After about 5 seconds or so, the shape diminished. About the doors. I spoke to my mother long after I'd moved out and told her about some of the things I saw with such regularity. I hadn't spoken about them because I felt confident no one would believe me, or that they would think I was being purposefully dramatic. That's when she told me how the doors would slam. Once, when I was about 3 years old, all the doors in the house started to slam. So the doors had to go or be replaced with much heavier versions. My replacement bedroom door was so heavy it bent the hinges downward. I can keep going, but this is getting long. To wrap it up, I don't claim to be sensitive or special. However, I have continued to experience strange and interesting events even after living in different locations. I don't know if I have a hanger-on. Any comments would be appreciated, or if I should submit more. Matt in Illinois. The uninvited roommate. To start, I want to explain that I'm not a huge believer in the supernatural. I consider myself a healthy skeptic with an open mind. For that reason, even though this may be one of the more mundane stories you get, it affected me profoundly. I attended a large university as an undergraduate, and come my senior year, 2 friends, let's call them Ken and Charlie, and I decided to rent a home together. We were poor, as college students tend to be, so the best we could do near campus was a small house that had to be 100 years old. To give you some sense, there was a room in the basement with walls stained black to shoulder height. My parents had to explain to me that this was an old coal storage room, and it would have been loaded through a small window to provide heat and cooking fuel back before the house had electricity. The rest of the house was small and similarly aged. The ground floor had a family room, a small kitchen, and a den. I used this as my bedroom. Upstairs there were 2 bedrooms and a very small bathroom, the only one in the house. It's important to note that there was essentially no hallway. The top of the stairs had a 4x4 landing, then straight ahead was the bathroom. On either side were the doors to my friend's rooms. We'd been living in the house for a few months without incident until one Saturday night when the three of us headed out to a campus bar. After a few hours, Charlie ran into a girl he knew in college, so we joined her and her friends for a few drinks. At some point, my friend left with the girl he knew, and Ken and I opted to stick around at the bar in case he needed some privacy. We stayed around until closing time and then walked home together. It was fairly late when we got home, but being college kids, and mostly nocturnal, we decided to stay up and play video games for an hour or so before turning in. About a half hour in, maybe 2:30 or so, we heard Charlie's door open. We heard him walk a few steps to the bathroom and then close that door. Ken made a comment that we'd find out in a few minutes if he got lucky. It was so mundane that we actually forgot about it for 20 minutes or so. At that point, we were ready for bed, and Ken complained that our friend was a jerk for not coming down and filling us in. We both retired to our rooms, but I had barely closed the door before Ken came barreling back downstairs. He never came home. His room's empty. He must have gone back to her place. We just sort of stood there in silence as we processed the implications. Ken is what I'd call a confirmed skeptic. To this day, he hates this story because he can't explain it. We weren't scared at the time. We weren't telling ghost stories. We'd never even discussed the house being haunted. Up until that moment, we didn't suspect something supernatural had happened, but it was unmistakable what we heard. The next morning, we filled in Charlie, who was mad that he had missed it. We talked about it all week, and the following weekend we decided to see what else might happen. Ken was out of town for the weekend, so Charlie and I came up with a plan. We had a party we were planning on going to, so we closed both doors to the upstairs bedrooms. Now yes, this was an old house, but those doors were heavy and the latches were very solid. We pushed, but neither of us could open them without turning the handle. Satisfied in our test, we locked up and left the house for the night. We returned home about 1 or 2 a.m., and honestly, it was like Christmas morning. We ran through the front door and bounded up the stairs to see if anything had occurred. Ken's door was wide open. We were sort of giddy. It's hard to explain. The alcohol may have played a role, but seeing that door open was amazing. To this day, I have no explanation for how that was even possible. When Ken got back, we shared the news. He was nonplussed, as in a week's time his skepticism had rehardened. Charlie and I decided not to mess with it anymore, half because we were worried if we kept testing, it wouldn't repeat, and we'd start to doubt, and half because we were afraid things might escalate and really get scary. We couldn't afford to move out. That should have been the end of this story, but of course it never is. Months passed, and nothing else occurred. We didn't forget about it, but it never really came up. One night, we were at another party, and we ran into a couple girls who had lived in the house the previous year. We laughed about the weird coal room and the way the ivy grew on the bathroom window. Suddenly, casually, one of the girls said, "Have you seen the old lady yet?" That remains to this day the eeriest thing anyone has ever said to me. We played dumb for a minute, and she explained that her roommate had lived in Ken's room and woke up one night to see an old lady standing in her closet. She freaked and ran out of the room to get someone, but of course, when they got back there, nobody was in the closet. This is usually the part of the story where we pack up and move out. But again, poor college kids. The semester was almost over, so we again pretended the conversation never happened and made it through the last few weeks of the year without incident. I have no idea what was going on in that house. It wasn't malevolent. It was like an echo. I'm reminded of a quote from a recent movie I watched. A house with a death in it can never again be bought or sold by the living. It can only be borrowed from the ghosts who have stayed behind. Perhaps we were the uninvited roommates.
My name is Lizzie, and I'm from North Carolina. I grew up in a house that we actually built. My parents built it, but the property that it was on was very old. Had a long history of different houses being built on it and torn down. And we actually had the shell of an old house removed from the property before we built ours. So I was about 8 years old. I was not a child that scared easy. I was a pretty blunt, straightforward child, and things like the paranormal and the dark and things like that just never really scared me. I remember I got up in the middle of the night to go get a glass of water, and I walked into the hallway, and there was a boy, a teenage boy, standing in the hallway. And I kind of saw him materialize in front of me, and I remember thinking for a second that my eyes were just adjusting to the dark and playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared at the spot, the more sharp he began to be, and I could see his belt buckles, I could see that he was wearing suspenders, I could tell he had brown hair. And he kind of cocked his head at me and seemed very friendly, and I didn't feel scared or threatened at all. I think I just kind of felt mildly surprised, and I remember just waving at him and then walking around him and going down the stairs to get my glass of water, and when I came back up to the hallway, he was gone. So the next day, I was playing outside, and my dad was trying to mow the lawn. And about halfway through mowing our front yard, the lawnmower broke down. And I don't know what gave me the idea to do this, but I remembered the night before, and I remembered seeing the boy, and I remembered that he had been standing in front of our attic door when I saw him. So I ran inside, and I went up to the attic. And I stood in the middle of the attic, and I introduced myself, and I said, "Hi, I don't know if you live here. If you do live here, that's okay. This can be your room. Nobody's ever really up here anyway. But if you're going to live here, it would be really nice if you could help out. And my dad's mower is not working right now. So if you could help, that would be great." And I started to walk down the stairs, and as I started to walk down the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me, really quick footsteps, and I turned around and didn't see anything. But right after the footsteps stopped, I heard my dad's mower come back on outside. And I just smiled and I said, "Thank you." And I just kind of went down the steps and went about with my day. And this actually happened probably about 4 or 5 times, where something in the house would break, and my parents would be completely stumped how to fix it. And I would go up to the attic and I would ask this boy if he would be able to help. And every single time, within seconds, whatever it is would be fixed. That kind of went along for about a year. In the midst of this, kind of towards the end of it, my parents actually adopted another girl, and so I had a sister. During the first year of her staying with us, she was older than me. I remember her waking me up and saying, "Is this house haunted?" And I kind of shrugged, and I said, I don't know if I would call it haunted. I do think that there's a boy that lives in the attic. I don't know if he's a ghost or a spirit or what the deal is, but there's a nice boy who lives in the attic. And she just nodded and she said, "I hear footsteps in the attic every single night before I go to bed." And I wasn't sure if it was just the house settling or if there was someone who lived up there. And she seemed equally unperturbed about this. Neither of us ever really had any negative connotations with the paranormal, so we both just kind of shrugged it off, and occasionally, weird things would happen, like never anything bad, but sometimes little mischievous things, like something would go missing until we very sternly asked the boy to give it back, and then always inevitably within seconds we would find it. He just always kind of felt like the third child in the house, I guess. We never asked my parents anything about it. Yeah, that's kind of what our experience was growing up with the boy in the house. And we did actually find out sometime later, after both of us had grown up and moved out, that there was a family that lived in the shell of the house that my parents had moved off the property. that house had been abandoned, or the shell of the house had been abandoned and kind of fallen into disarray over the span of about 30 years. And it had burned down, and there was a family that died when it burned down. And they did have 2 kids. And so kind of the other part of this story is that when my parents had the shell of that house moved off of our property, our neighbor actually bought the shell and had it moved onto some acreage adjacent to ours and rebuilt it to look like how the house would have looked, was still standing and lived in. And so my neighbor built it back up and decided to rent it out. And I very distinctly remember while I was growing up, the entire time that I was growing up, he could never get anybody to stay there. Everybody ended up leaving after 6 months. And all of them said that it was because it was haunted. And all of them had the same story. All of them said that there was a very angry, aggressive male who they would see in the windows if they got home from work late. Sometimes they would wake up with scratches on their arms. Sometimes they would see handprints in the fog of their mirrors after taking a shower. All sorts of... there was one neighbor who used to say that she would see somebody laying in the bed next to her at night. And anytime a child lived in that house, they would always say that they could see a little girl, either in the window or hiding outside in the woods just outside of the house, and that sometimes they could hear her laughing in the stairwell. So I don't know if that's the other child from the family, and the teenage boy that I grew up with was the other. I always kind of had this theory that maybe the father and the son didn't get along very well, and the son just decided to stick behind after the shell of the house got moved, but that's just a theory. But anyway, so that's my story. That's my encounter with the friendly little ghost that lives in my parents' attic, presumably still lives there. Thank you so much for listening.
This next story is from Sophia in Chicago, Illinois. Alice. I moved into a small new apartment in downtown Chicago a few months ago. I thought it was charming, as did my roommate. There were 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen. At first, nothing was out of the ordinary. Then one night, I was brushing my teeth, and the shower curtains started opening and closing by itself. I reached for the door handle and tried to open it, but the doorknob only shook violently and refused to open. I eventually opened the door and went to bed, freaking out. Somehow I fell asleep. I woke up around 11 p.m. to hear the shower running, and I assumed it was my roommate. I knocked on the door to make sure it was her. I was still shaking from the previous experience. My roommate did not respond, and the shower shut off. I decided to check the bathroom. I stepped inside. It was steaming, and the mirror was all fogged up. I turned on the water to wash my face, but no water came on. I then headed to the kitchen to make myself some tea. I was unable to go back to sleep at that point, so I waited until morning and went to work. I didn't experience anything else for a few days. Then I saw who I call Alice. I had awakened in the middle of the night to check my clock, but it had been disconnected. Then I heard soft sobbing. I looked up to see a small blonde child. She couldn't have been any older than 5. She was standing at the foot of my bed. The weeping child looked up at me, and I reached out to her, but she disappeared before I could touch her. I can't explain how I knew this, but I know her name was Alice. I just do. Alice visited me every night and left the same way, by just disappearing. And then, after a while, she showed up, but never came back again. Okay, this next story is from Tom in Berlin, and it's probably sleep paralysis, but it could be an out-of-body experience, but I'll let you listen to it and decide. In the 1970s, we were living in Ohio. My wife worked days and I worked nights. One early morning, as I awoke without opening my eyes, I could hear my wife moving about in the next room. I found that I was lying on my back with my hands on my chest. Without panic, I realized that I was completely paralyzed and could not even open my eyelids. I tried to move my foot, and even to make a sound to shake me out of this condition. Nothing worked. I hoped that my wife would brush up against the bed and release me from this strange condition. I was fully alert, but trapped in this paralyzed body. Still not panicking and finding this condition interesting, I tried another method to get me out of this. I thought that if I could stretch my arms out wide, this would help. For some reason, I thought and felt that I really did move my physical arms. Then, my eyes opened to see that for a split second, my physical hands were still on my chest, but at the same time, I saw my spirit hand slide into my physical hands, like putting on gloves. And this next story is from a longtime friend of mine, Marea in West Hollywood, California. Black Cloak Woman. When I was a little girl, about 5 or 6 years old, I was terrified of going to sleep. I could not explain to my mother what was going on, because I was so young and did not quite know myself. But every time she would put me to bed, I would be terrified and really dread going to sleep. Once I was settled into bed and pulled the blankets over me, I cannot remember if I had fallen asleep or if I had just had my eyes closed. But I would see a ghost-like lady with some kind of black cloak around her face, and she would be moving back and forth, closer, then further away from me, and she would keep repeating, "I did that better than you. I did that better than you." It was so terrifying, and I did not know why this lady was doing this to me. This continued for maybe a half a year, until I couldn't take it any longer. I was so afraid. So one night, I shot up in my bed and shouted back at her, "No! I did it better than you!" And after so long of seeing her, I never saw her again. The story's from Mark in Whittier, California. Old Mexican Pueblo entity. A few years back, we visited my parents' old hometown in Mexico during the annual festivals. My mother's old childhood home was on a ranch and pretty dilapidated, and was in a very rural area. My sister, who was into the occult and alchemy, and I wanted to stay the night there. No electricity, and kind of drafty. We shared a bed, her sleeping on the wall side, and me on the edge. During the night, I was awakened, not by a noise, but by an encroaching presence or entity. I was frightened to see a shadow materialize right from the stone corner of the room. It was at the edge of the bed and made it known, not audibly but telepathically. At least that's what I felt. But it said that it wanted my sister and that I was in the way. I tried waking up my sister, but she was sleeping hard. It looked like a blurry shadow and had no facial features. After a solid minute, it retreated back into the corner, as if a blanket was dropped, and disappeared slowly. This is from Erin in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Haunted 1920s Bungalow. When I was about 16, in 2003, I was home alone in the evening. I only lived with my mom, and it was common for her to be out in the evening with friends. I was in my room, in our 1920s bungalow. The house was dark, and nothing else was on but my small TV. I was watching America's Most Wanted and expecting Mum home relatively soon. Our driveway went to the backyard from the front, so I expected to hear the back door opening at some point. The house was very small, 2 bedrooms and a rec room type addition on the back. While I was watching TV, I heard the back door open. Keeping in mind the house was small and the back room was on the other side of the wall. I then heard the light switch flick on and a thud on the wall, the same wall I was leaning on. Then I heard heavy footsteps going into the kitchen and then flicking the kitchen light on. At this point, I assumed it was my mom, so I called out, "Mom!" No response. I called out again, a little more hesitantly, "Mom?" My heart started to race a little, because I didn't see any light coming from under the door. I wasn't fully dressed at the time, which made me feel even more vulnerable, so I quickly jumped up and put on my pajama shorts. Then I opened my bedroom door slowly. It was totally dark. I slowly moved to the light switch. Nobody was there. I moved back into the back room, reaching in and flicking on the light. Empty. Mum was not home. No car in the driveway. I was alone, and yet I heard very distinctly the door opening, heavy footsteps, and the light switch flicking on. These are a pattern of sounds I was familiar with at the time. I went back to my room and finished my show. Mum came home later and I told her everything, but we had no explanation. And this is a story from Nathan in New Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The Lady in Black. This experience happened to my 3 sisters and myself in 1971 in our hometown of Clearfield, Pennsylvania. I was 9 years old when this story took place, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I'm the youngest and the only boy of 5 children. In 1971, our parents bought a huge old house on South 2nd Street. 2 marble fireplaces, beautiful woodwork, hardwood floors, stained glass windows. The house had been neglected, but still in good condition, and they got it at a good price. So we moved in and began living there and fixing it up little by little. This house ended up being the family home for over 40 years. But the events I'm about to relate to you took place in the first few months that we lived there. I was in the 2nd grade with my 3 older sisters, Debbie being in 8th grade, Linda and Bonnie out of high school and working in their first jobs, but not married and still living at home. Our parents' bedroom was on the 1st floor, while all of us kids had bedrooms on the 2nd floor. When going up the huge staircase, there was a long, L-shaped corridor that led to each bedroom. My room was the first, then Linda, Debbie, and Bonnie. And the last room at the end of the long hall was the bathroom. Mom and Dad had to get up much earlier than the rest of us to go to work, leaving the older girls to take care of getting the younger ones up and ready for school. One night, our oldest sister, Bonnie, was lying in her bed and reading. After a time, she began to have an uneasy feeling. Looking up from her book, she was startled to see a lady leaning into the doorway of her bedroom, looking at her. She had dark hair swept in a high Gibson girl-type hairstyle, a long skirt black dress with a high collar, long sleeves with puffed shoulders. My sister said she stared at her rather unkindly, to the extent that she felt a little frightened. She got a hold of her courage and firmly told the lady, Go away!" She then closed her eyes and opened them, and the lady in black had gone. She didn't sleep well that night, but eventually things went back to normal for her, and she quickly forgot about it, reasoning that her eyes were tired from reading too much. On a morning not long after this, Bonnie woke our sister Debbie up for school. Debbie made her way down the hall to go into the bathroom to start getting ready. She realized that Bonnie was not out of the bathroom yet, and rather than walk back down to her room, she went in and laid down on Bonnie's bed to wait. She had not been resting long when she had a strange feeling and opened her eyes. She saw a lady in a long black dress with dark hair leaning over the bed, staring at her unkindly. For a second, she thought it was Bonnie scolding her for falling back asleep when she should be getting ready for school, and she said, "I'm awake, I'm getting up." The lady disappeared after she spoke, as Bonnie responded from the bathroom, "What did you say?" making Debbie realize it truly was not Bonnie standing in the room. On another occasion, our other sister, Linda, came home from work for lunch. She started to go up the stairs to get something, but stopped halfway up, for standing at the top of the stairs and looking down at her was the lady in black. It frightened her so much, she turned and went back down the stairs and out of the house as fast as she could. As she sat in the car in the driveway, she looked back up at the window and saw the dark figure silhouetted, watching her leave. Lastly, I was getting dressed one day for Linda to take me to school. She had warned me to hurry, as she didn't want to be late for work. I put on my pants and shirt, grabbed my shoes and socks, and raced downstairs, with the idea of beating her to the kitchen and making her wait. I was sitting in the chair, putting on my socks, when I had a strange feeling. I looked over to see a lady dressed in black, with her dark hair pinned up. She was leaning in the doorway, watching me. I thought it was my sister, Linda, making sure I was getting ready, so I continued to tie my shoes. When I looked up again, she was gone. Thinking nothing of it, I proceeded into the kitchen, surprised to see Linda there, and her hair was not pinned up. It was long and straight down her back, as was the style at the time. I asked her how she got her hair brushed out and got downstairs into the kitchen, when I had just seen her a minute ago standing upstairs in the doorway. She looked at me strangely and said it wasn't her, that she had been downstairs for quite a while. A few other odd things happened. Lights would go on and off, and when you were downstairs, you would swear you could hear walking on the floor above, when nobody was upstairs. But after we had lived there about a year, it became home, and nothing strange ever happened again. The four of us siblings never mentioned these incidents to each other until about 7 years later. The beautiful old marble fireplace had come loose from the wall, and my dad set out to repair it. Before putting it back in place, he looked behind it. There he found a birthday greeting and a postcard of congratulations for the new house, both written to Mrs. Elsie Norris, with our house address and the post-date stamp of 1908. My dad saw something else when he pulled out the fireplace a little further. He came out with an old faded photograph of a lady in a long black dress with a high collar, long sleeves, and puffed shoulders. Her hair was piled into a Gibson girl hairstyle, and she wore a large hat with a feather in it. The four of us looked at the photograph, recognizing Our Lady in Black from seeing her the first year we lived there. That is when we shared our individual stories with each other. We decided that she was just checking us out to see what kind of people were living in her house. And once she saw we meant no harm and were fixing it up, she stopped coming. We never did see her again, but from then on, we grew up, and we would retell how, when we first moved into the house, how we had each been visited by the lady in black. This story's from Debbie in the U.S. New friend. The year was 1997, and I was 14 years old. I had just finished up the 8th grade. I was an awkward and moody teen, already developing worries regarding life's big questions. I had a goofy sense of humor and preferred to remain on the sidelines of life, observing, analyzing, and fabricating little theories. I didn't have many friends back then, but I was drawn to other misfits like myself. Anyhow, I had just been given word that my aunt was ill and had been hospitalized. She suffered an aneurysm, and it left her unconscious and completely unresponsive. I was at home alone one night that week while my parents were at the hospital. I had recently met a new boy, Eric, and thought I'd call him up. He was a peculiar adolescent male, with an emotional intelligence much higher than a normal guy for that age. He was tall and stocky, which made him look older than he was. He had a soft voice and a calm demeanor, and his parents weren't strict like mine. There was something very trustworthy about him, and I hoped he'd be strong for me during this vulnerable time. Thankfully, he picked up the phone and was willing to listen to me bawl about my current predicament. I managed to explain to him, I just wish I knew if she was ever going to wake up. I guess the doctors said her brain activity is practically non-existent. Maybe you should read tarot cards. Sometimes they give you more perspective. Do you want me to get them? He offered, joining me on my quest for answers. I didn't know I'd call a psychic line. Oh, sure, why not? But I'm scared. I whimpered through my sobs. What if they say something bad? They might, but we need to know. Hang on, I'm shuffling. He replied, his voice reduced down to a whisper. I could hear the crackle of the cards through the receiver. I waited as patiently as I could while he dealt them and interpreted their meanings. After a few minutes, Eric reached his conclusion. My aunt wasn't going to live. I'm sure I bawled again when he put forth the information, not knowing what to believe. He stayed on the line with me for some time, all the way until I heard our garage door open and the car doors slam shut. My parents were home, and it was time to hang up. Eric and his tarot cards turned out to be quite accurate. Just a few hours after our conversation, my aunt slipped away from us. My family and I received the news the following morning, and we would attend her services that weekend. Fast forward to the wake. As I'd mentioned, I was a self-conscious child, with the propensity to retreat into my mind when things got uncomfortable. I can recall sitting down immediately after we arrived in some chairs that lined the wall of the entryway at the funeral home. The place was packed with relatives. Most I recognized. The rest I assumed were Aunt Joan's friends I'd never met, or family members from her husband's side. I sat down as the rest of the family continued on, greeting others and giving hugs. I wanted to do the same, but needed to observe first and make my preparations. I wasn't the only person sitting in those chairs. Most of the others seated there, however, sat with another person, quietly conversing and glancing around with glassy eyes, wiping each other's tears away, helping each other work through the pain. As I made my observations, I made eye contact with a girl, perhaps just a few years older than me. She was also sitting alone on the opposite side of the room. As she gazed back at me, She smiled and waved. I got the feeling she had been staring over at me before I had taken notice of her. I must have looked confused, staring back at her, trying to recognize her face. I concluded that I didn't know her and had never seen her before. She continued with big grins, and I had to look around to be sure she wasn't engaging with another relative, me awkwardly positioned in her line of vision. But she wasn't smiling and waving at anyone else. It was me whom she attempted to interact with. I must say, this gave me quite a startle, and all I could think to do was display a meek half-smile back at her. She rose up from her seat and headed across the room to where I sat, forcing me to brace for interaction with an unknown. Even though I didn't wish to speak to her, I didn't get up and go to my family. I didn't move at all. Instead, I sat in my seat, frozen in confusion, watching her make her way toward me. Once she arrived, she sat down right next to me. Her body language was suggesting comfort, familiarity, and confidence. "Hi, I like your dress," she squealed, maintaining her joyful-looking face and intent focus on me, and only me. She had wavy, dirty blonde hair that she wore down. She was quite thin, her face was long and pointy. She wore dark eyeliner around her eyes, with bright lids, the shade of which I don't recall. I took a breath and did my best to smile back. "Thanks," I said, giving her a once-over. I like yours, too." Her smile lengthened as she lifted her gaze from me to glance around the room. The two of us sat isolated in the corner, gleaning information from our environment, together, but not really together. I discreetly kept my eye on her, trying to read her face, and pleading to myself to remember who she could be. I stayed quiet, still overwhelmed with the aftermath of my aunt's death, this funeral and the associated swarm of people I'd soon reluctantly be part of. As I observed her, I could see that smile dissipate, all of her original expression falling to the floor. Finally, she turned to me. "What side of the family are you on?" she asked me, exempt of the confidence I could feel at first. Struggling to understand her inquiry, I replied, "Aunt Jones. She was my aunt, my mom's sister. How do you know her?" She seemed displeased at this question. Her eyes darted around, perhaps searching for an answer. "Uncle Jeff," she blurted out quickly, making it obvious that she did not wish to speak further on the subject. There was a heavy silence for a moment, until the crazed smile returned to her face. She looked at me and asked me, "Do you want to be best friends?" "Sure, yeah," I replied, doing all I could to hide my growing suspicion. "Sure, let's be best friends." She kept staring at me, pleased with my response, with that out-of-place grin cracked across her face. For reasons unclear to me now, I stayed where I was and remained in this odd interaction. I stood there, with my mind raced. Where did my parents and sister go? Who is this girl, and why is she focused on me? Why do I feel frozen in this corner, and like I want to crawl out of my skin? What happens when we die? Why is the smell of all the flowers here making me feel sick? Why does this girl look so damn happy? "Do you want to go down in the basement?" she asked, bringing the racing thoughts to a halt. "I don't know. What's down there?" I asked, somewhat fearful of what the answer would be. "Oh, just a bathroom," she replied, letting out a little giggle. Why did she giggle? What the hell is so funny about going downstairs to the bathroom? "Okay, sure, let's go," I said flatly. As we made our way toward the stairs, my father and I exchanged glances from across the room. He had positioned himself closer to the casket and was talking with other family members. His eyes were soft, sad, even, but something about our exchange of glances made me feel safer in that moment. He wasn't questioning my current behavior, so I gathered that I didn't need to either. Once downstairs, we found a spread of non-nutritious foods on a table near the bathroom. She grabbed from the bowls of snacks, not bothering to take a paper plate from the stack that sat on the table. She took fistfuls of whatever she pleased, stuffing her mouth full before going in for more. She crunched and munched for a good while, and all the while I just stood there, awkwardly watching her eat more and more. She brushed her hands together to get rid of the crumbs. She smiled again as she sauntered into the bathroom. She went into the furthest stall and playfully pushed the door open. I think she even let out a gleeful giggle as she closed the door to her stall, and I closed the door to mine. As I sat down on the toilet, I felt unnerved, and I decided I would be putting a stop to this peculiar connection just as soon as I was finished. I stood up and flushed, and then could hear someone making their way down the wooden basement stairs. I opened the stall to find Aunt Rose. "Hi, sweetie," she said with a sniffle. I could see her eyes were misty and red. "Hi," I said, and turned around to look at the stalls. All empty. "Hey, did you see a girl in here when you came in? She was in that stall." I pointed to the big stall all the way at the end, where my new acquaintance had just been. Aunt Rose looked confused. "A girl? No, there was no girl with you." "Yeah, she was here. She was in that stall." Sweetie, you were the only other person in here when I came in." There was an awkward silence as Aunt Rose and I stood there looking at each other. When we left the bathroom, the girl was not by the snack table, nor was she upstairs with the masses seated in the chairs, or anywhere outside. I spent some confused minutes looking for her, but she was surely and definitely gone. My family and I remained at the wake for several more hours. I continued nervously looking around for her, but she never resurfaced. I fixated on finding out who she was. Perhaps if someone knew her, they could offer an explanation for her strange behavior. I asked cousins, aunts, uncles, my own parents, if they had seen me interacting with this person, or if they knew who she was. I asked right after the interactions with her, and again later on, when a bunch of us gathered at my Aunt Linda's house. I hoped someone could identify her. But it became very clear to me that no one at all had taken note of the girl, and certainly not my interactions with her. No one had recollection of me sitting with her in the corner or going downstairs, and no one could fathom who she could have been when I provided a very detailed description of her physical appearance. My father could recall observing me walking toward the stairs, but he, like all the rest of them, had not seen her. No one had seen her. No one had interacted with her. And no one remembered her. That is, no one except for me. I'm putting together show number 238, so if you have a personal paranormal experience or local ghost legend you would like to share, send it to lex@anythingghost.com or go to anythingghost.com and fill out the contact form and send me that. And for everything Anything Ghost, go to www.anythingghost.com. Don't forget about the VIP group if you want to get the complete archives of Anything Ghost dating back to that very first show in January of 2006. Then get more information at www.anythingghost.com and go to the Join the VIP Group tab. All right, everybody, thanks for all your great stories for this show, number 238.